But then again, Reform to me look like they're having a little bit of a wobble. Farage in particular seems a bit shaky about that big personal donation he received, and I wonder if those donors will start to take a second look. Maybe not Harborne, I presume, because he seems very tied to Farage personally, but maybe some will start to drift back to the Conservatives.
I'm joined now by the Bloomberg political columnist Rosa Prince. Hello, Rosa.
Good morning.
Thanks for being with us. Let's dive in. Let's talk about Andy Burnham up first, because he is, barring extraordinary unforeseen circumstances, going to be Prime Minister within a few weeks. We've heard very little from him so far. How much will that change at 11:30 when he delivers what's being billed as a major policy speech?
Yeah, well, I think he gets to flesh out his ideas, which he seems to be putting at the centre of his premiership, and that's to devolve power, both fiscally, putting money in the hands of the regions, but also a kind of mood shift, a sort of vibe shift away from London up to the north, Manchester in particular, obviously. But he's saying he wants to transform every postcode in Britain, and I think that's because he's addressing this sort of slight, tentative concern among not just the Daily Mail that you were reading out there, but also his own backbenchers, that the South will feel a bit left behind. Labour's obviously strong in London and other pockets of the South. So, yeah, he's sort of, very much for Manchester, but also for the whole country too.
We'll come on to the specifics of devolution in a moment, but just in terms of the tone he's starting with. So the Times' Steve Swinford notes today that one of Keir Starmer's biggest political mistakes was beginning his premiership by telling people that it was all going to get worse before it got better, and everything was very grim and depressing, and Rachel Reeves did not help. Should we expect Burnham to strike a sort of much more optimistic note, to try and just begin on a completely different trajectory?
Yeah, I think Stephen's absolutely right there. I mean, partly it's temperament. You can kind of tell that Burnham is just a bit more of a relaxed guy, probably more of an optimist. Keir Starmer always looked a bit kind of uptight and tense, didn't he? A little bit anxious. So I think there's that different personality. He's got a bit more charisma. But yeah, very much so. I would agree that the sort of opening days of a premiership are important. They set the mood. They kind of set the tone. And Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, that early mistake of going out there and making your big policy, not something really, really great, really happy, say as Gordon Brown and Tony Blair did, independence for the Bank of England. That was a really strong and forward-looking message. If the first thing you do is to cut benefits for winter fuel, which is what Starmer and Reeves did, what a mistake. So Burnham, I think, is going to try and do something big like that. I wonder, I don't know if he'll announce it today or whether he'll wait till he gets into government, but there's been some talk about whether he would even split up the Treasury, create a kind of growth department. Could that department be based in the north, for example? So I would expect something quite radical. If not today, maybe he'll save the specifics for once he's finally kind of got the keys to number 10. But I think he will. I think he'll want to strike out on a positive note.
I mean, that question of what he'll do on devolution that will be radical. Because, I mean, devolution, like, on one level, it's all very exciting, this, talking about reconfiguring the country, raising up the bits of it that are lagging. On another level, this is what everyone says. John Prescott and Tony Blair tried to introduce regional assemblies. George Osborne and David Cameron had the Northern Powerhouse. Boris Johnson had levelling up. Is there any reason to expect this is going to be particularly different from all of those? Yeah,
and there's a reason that they all do that, and that's because the UK is, I think, one of the most centralised countries in the Western world. Local government raises and spends only 5% of the national income. That's compared to somewhere like Canada, I was reading this morning, it's 50%. So there's a reason. But yeah, as you say, there's a long list of people who've talked about that. Will Burnham be any different? A lot of the briefing we've had from the speech, I mean, it's not fair to totally judge a speech by the pre-briefing, but it's hard to see much in there that Keir Starmer wouldn't disagree with, maybe would have even said himself. I think the fact that Andy Burnham has been a regional mayor, he was mayor of Manchester for 9 years, puts him in a really strong position. If he can make a go of it, you would think it would be him. But yeah, it's easy to talk about this stuff, much harder to put it into practice with concrete measures.
What do you think about the fact, we were talking about this earlier, that he's not going to be taking any questions, that he's just delivering his speech and then sort of slipping quietly away?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a journalist, so obviously I have to find this outrageous.
Always questions, yeah.
I think if that's how he's going to conduct business once he's Prime Minister, that would be a mistake and a shame and bad for democracy and bad for not just journalism, because it's not just about us, it's about us as a conduit to the public. And when you're asking questions of a Prime Minister as a reporter, you're asking on behalf of voters. I can see why he wants to do it this time around. He's not Prime Minister yet. There is theoretically still a possibility of a leadership contest. It's not going to happen, but, you can imagine he doesn't want to kind of get ahead of himself. He's also got those really big decisions to take, like the identity of who he's going to pick as his Chancellor, which he's probably not ready to be talking about now. And he wants the kind of write-up from the speech, as we just said, to be a positive message about his devolution agenda, and not, Andy Burnham has refused to say whether or not Ed Miliband's going to be his Chancellor. So, bit concerned about it, but as long as he knocks this on the head once he actually is Prime Minister, then OK, we'll let him slide this time.
Well, look, whoever he picks as Chancellor, he won't be as good as our Chancellor. This show's cheerful Chancellor, Times columnist and economist Paul Johnson. Good morning, Paul.
Morning.
So, look, we just listed some of the previous attempts to rebalance the economy away from London and the South East. Just how unbalanced are we? How much of a problem is it?
Well, we're pretty unbalanced. I mean, partly, of course, that's because London is so successful. I mean, there are plenty of other countries who would love to have a London. I mean, France has Paris, but the Germans don't have a city as big and successful as London, and nor do the Spanish or really the Italians. So we should first of all say we are very lucky to have London. But it is the case that our second cities, our Manchesters, our Birminghams, South York, the various cities in South Yorkshire, they are nowhere near as productive or well off as similar sized cities across the rest of Europe. So Paris is dominant in France, but places like Lyon and Toulouse are much richer than places like Manchester and Birmingham. So we've got that particular problem. We also, of course, have problems with the much more left behind part. So it's very important to say these are two totally different things. The fact that Birmingham and Manchester are poor relative to London is very different from the fact that Blackpool and Clacton are incredibly poor relative to the rest of the country, and they will need different sorts of solutions.
If Manchester is the model, at least for half of what you're talking about there, Paul, is it the idea of making basically every region have a Manchester? Is that feasible?
Well, in a sense, I mean, most regions do. I mean, they have mayoral authorities with varying, but largely, broadly similar sets of powers. Now, what's happened in Manchester, of course, is something that's happened over a long period of time, much predates Andy Burnham. And you go there, the building in the centre is extraordinary. The numbers of people, I can't remember exact numbers, but I think the numbers of people living in the centre of Manchester have something like tenfold over the last 20 or 30 years. So you can do that kind of thing with a pro-business friendly approach to planning and all those sorts of things. And whilst Manchester has been growing relatively fast over the last 10 years, and I repeat the point, it is still much poorer than it ought to be relative to similar sized cities in the rest of Europe.
Rosa?
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there a trade-off here? If you kind of boost the regions, does London inevitably suffer? I think there was some briefing around saying that Burnham was going to say it's going to be good for the South too, because you won't have the North being a drain on the taxpayer anymore. Is that right, or is it inevitably a choice?
I don't think it is necessarily a choice. I mean, you clearly can do it in a way that makes it look like a bit of a choice. But Andy Burnham is certainly right that, London pays vastly more in tax than it receives back in benefits, in investment and spending. And most of the rest of the country receives a lot more in spending than it pays in tax. That's partly a reflection, it's largely a reflection of what a very unbalanced economy that we are. So you can certainly have a bit of a win here. But of course, if that means that you invest in places outside of London and reduce investment in London, then that is a cost to London and the South East. And you do genuinely get big returns by investing in this very effective, very productive part of the country. So what it shouldn't result in, I don't think, is saying we're going to stop investment in London because they're rich enough and start investing elsewhere. What you need to do is, as he's talking about, changing the structure of devolution, maybe changing the way that some of these things are funded, maybe doing things in the skills and infrastructure area, but it shouldn't mean taking money from what is the economic powerhouse of the country.
And is there a danger, Paul, of devolution creating sort of a responsibility gap? Because, mayors and devolved authorities will have greater control over social housing and welfare and education and stuff like that, but the Treasury is still going to have to bail them out if it all goes wrong.
Well, I think there's always a problem, isn't there, that whether you look at the Scottish government or indeed the Manchester Authority or anywhere else, it's very easy for the people in charge there to say things are going wrong here, but it's not my fault. It's because of those horrible people in Whitehall, and particularly because we're not used to this level of devolution, and particularly because I think, frankly, not very many people understand exactly what is and what isn't devolved. I think the problem is exactly that. You've always got someone else to blame, and I think the only way around that is to get this up and running, to have a similar set of responsibilities for all of these authorities, so it's easier to explain, and to be very clear about those things which the mayors or the authorities are and are not responsible for. But I do think you can't get around the fact, and we see this all the time with the devolved nations, it's the fault of Whitehall for not giving us enough money, and I don't think you can easily get around that.
Paul, one more on the specifics before I let you go. We've heard two people who we expect to have big jobs in the Burnham government, Wes Streeting and Louise Haigh, both proposing to bring capital gains tax in line with income tax. That would presumably raise quite a lot of money. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, it wouldn't raise a great deal of money. It might raise a bit. If you simply took the current system and increased the rates to income tax levels, that's a bad idea. And why is that a bad idea? Because at the moment, you pay capital gains tax on purely nominal gains. So if you own something and its value simply goes up in line with inflation, then you pay tax on that. So if you increase that rate of tax, you really would significantly reduce the incentives to invest. You really would put off entrepreneurship and investment. So at the very least, if you're going to do that, and this would not be a bad idea, you need to give an allowance for inflation so that you're not paying tax on purely inflationary gains. Now, that's exactly what we had until 1997 or 1998. That's what Nigel Lawson put in place in the 1980s. And we spent the last 30 years messing around with the system. But I think the key thing is that will be a sensible change, but don't expect it to raise piles and piles of money. I think there is this kind of delusion that capital gains tax can suddenly fix a big hole in the public finances. It can't. It's just not big enough. It's less than much less than £1 in 10 that income tax raises, for example.
Well, let's check in on the Paul Johnson optimism meter before I let you go, Paul. Yeah, sort of rising a bit at the beginning and then drop like a cliff at the end. Times columnist and economist Paul Johnson, thank you very much indeed, as ever. Up next, Zia Youssef is a big figure in reform, so why won't they let him stand in a by-election? We'll find out. This is Hugo Rifkind here on Times Radio, still joined by the Bloomberg political columnist Rosa Prince. The British Thai cryptocurrency billionaire who gave the Reform UK's leader Nigel Farage a gift of £5 million before he became an MP has registered to vote in Britain. Christopher Harborne is the party's largest donor already. He's donated £15 million to Reform since 2025. The decision to move his voting registration may be so he can pave the way to give the party even more. Rosa, how much of a difference does this make?
Yeah, fascinating. So there's a cap due to come in, which would limit donations to 100,000. That meant,
for overseas donors.
For overseas donors,
yep.
Excuse me. So by bringing his status into the UK, the amount he can give is much larger. He has said when this rule came in, it's specifically targeting me and I'm going to double down. So obviously, Reform are a party that's very new. They're still creating their infrastructure. They're getting everything set up and money matters. So I think it is very significant.
I mean, Reform has already received around £15 million from him since 2025, and that's putting aside, of course, the money that he directly gave to Nigel Farage for entirely non-political purposes. Is that an unusual level of funding from a single donor?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the Tories were always the ones who did very well with the big money guys, and a lot of them seem to be shifting. So there is this kind of recalibration. Now, they do seem dependent on a small group of very large donors. I wonder how much they're getting from the kind of rank and file. Obviously they don't have a trade union membership like the Labour Party. They don't have a very institutionalised pattern of giving like the Conservatives. But then again, Reform to me look like they're having a little bit of a wobble. Farage in particular seems a bit shaky about that big personal donation he received. And I wonder if those donors will start to take a second look. Maybe not Harborne, I presume, because he seems very tied to Farage personally. But maybe some will start to drift back to the Conservatives. Yeah,
that's certainly what the Conservatives will be hoping. Look, speaking of Reform, Zia Youssef appeared on Question Time last week, where other panellists pointed out that he's yet to stand in an election for reform, and he hit back after a fashion. Have a listen to this.
Have you put your name forward to stand in by-elections?
We have an application process to stand in parliamentary by-elections, and all I'd say is that coming after me for not being willing to stand in a parliamentary by-election is incorrect and hugely presumptuous.
What did they do? Why did they stop?
Did they refuse you?
So, Rosa, that sounds a bit like he wanted to stand in a reform by-election and the party wouldn't let him. That's quite embarrassing.
Yeah, he's a really fascinating figure because there's definitely some tension there between the kind of Robert Jenrick's and Suella Braverman's, the former Conservatives who defected, and the sort of long marchers in the form of people who've been around for quite a long time. Interesting why he wasn't selected. Maybe they're regretting it now because the last two candidates didn't seem to go that well for them. I think they probably thought in Makerfield that they needed a local guy, which is why they went for Robert Kenyon, who had stood for them before. I think maybe they thought they needed a kind of working class, who famously kept going on about how he was a plumber. They needed to speak to that contingency. But why was Matthew Goodwin selected ahead of Zia Youssef in Gorton and Denton? Bit of a mystery. Youssef, if you remember, a year or so ago walked out. He had a big clash with Farage and about his kind of standing in the party, and I think it was with Sarah Pochen, wasn't it? Who then was the new MP, about when she announced that there was going to be a burqa ban. So yeah, maybe they better rustle up a seat for him quite soon.
Well, I mean, it's like on one level it's just sort of internal party admin who you pick to stand in a by-election, but on another level, the fact that they've had two failed candidates in by-elections, both of which were winnable by-elections. They've been extremely different candidates. It does make you think the reason why they can't pick the right candidate in a by-election, up to and including members of their own party hierarchy, is because they can't quite decide who they are.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. I think, are they the kind of smart left-wingers who have got this corporate links and they're talking to the city, or are they the salt of the earth northerners? I mean, in a way, it's good to have that kind of coalition, but if you can't resolve the way that you feel about yourself, then the coalition sort of doesn't really hang together. And yeah, they're so focused on Farage as the leader, as their kind of talisman, then when he's having a bad couple of weeks, it feels like the whole party is a bit shaky. And then there's the fact that Farage tends to fall out with people. The rise of Restore Britain, this very right-wing party led by Rupert Lowe. He had been a former Reform MP, obviously, and then had a big fallout with Farage. So, yeah, I think Youssef is a really interesting figure in the party. I mean, he's their Home Affairs spokesperson, so you'd think they'd get a decent seat for him soon.
Seems to be a party entirely made out of people who fall out with people. Look, we'll deal with this one quickly because we've not got very long, but members of the public are going to replace judges in deciding asylum appeals on reforms to speed up the deportation of illegal migrants. The Home Secretary is going to announce that, we think, pretty imminently. Is it realistic to expect members of the public to do this rather than lawyers?
I can't see it. I mean, there aren't that many lay magistrates. We sort of need them. What kind of person would be stepping forward to be on a tribunal? If it's a self-selecting group, you think, would they be too lenient? Or maybe the other way, maybe they'd reject everyone. So, yeah, to me it seems a bit half-baked. Maybe when we hear the details, it'll make a bit more sense.
At present, it seems like the sort of thing that would lead to more appeals afterwards, slowing down the process rather than speeding up the process and so on.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if the name of the game is to whip through this, then I can't see that this makes sense personally, but yeah.
Well, I'm sure we'll get deeper into that. Rosa Prince, what a pleasure having you here. Rosa is a Bloomberg political columnist. Thanks very much for being with us.